Hey all, so by now you should have finished your History 9/11 DBQ and be done with that content. And we're going to dive a little bit into some Englishy things here, looking at some poetry that came along with 9/11. So you'll want to set up a brief notes entry here where you're at least writing down the key terms and probably title it 9/11 in Poetry and Enjambment. Fancy Englishy term we're going to dig into today. So we're operating in this unit like we always do, with the understanding that art, music, and literature help us understand and deal with disasters, both personal and national disasters like 9/11, World War II, the Great Depression, the things we spend our time studying. They help us connect to each other and capture feelings that otherwise can be really difficult to express and capture. So what we're going to do in this unit is use poetry to connect to difficult experiences the nation went through 20 years ago and to explore difficult experiences we're going through as a nation today. So we're mostly going to study the September Suite by Lucille Clifton. This is a series of 7 poems that Lucille Clifton wrote in the days right after 9/11. Each poem is titled a date, one for each of the 7 days after 9/11, starting from 9/11 to 9/17/2001. This is Lucille Clifton. She was born in Depew, New York in 1936. She died of cancer in 2010. And during her career, she'd worked for federal and state governments in various positions for decades. She was quite an acclaimed poet, having won the Pulitzer Prize and various other prestigious writing awards over her career. So, quick, tiny little background there. So let's get into the meat of things. Make sure you write down these 2 key terms here. We're going to use September Suite to study the literary device enjambment. Enjambment just means continuing a sentence past the end of the line without stopping. And we're going to look at some examples of it here in a minute. Enjambment is the opposite of an end stop, and an end stop occurs when a line of poetry ends with a period or a colon, some sort of definite punctuation mark that finishes the sentence. That's an end stop. Okay, so what are some ways that poets use enjambment? We're going to look at 3 ways that poets use enjambment. So I would set up number 1 here. The first way poets use enjambment is to create emphasis and structure. So we're going to look at this example. It is a single stanza from the poem The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, and it's about spring, which we're living through right now, so I thought it was a good choice. First, let's just read it. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Okay, so Eliot's writing about how April is sort of this gross month where it's muddy, where things are like thawing and rotting and then flowers are growing out of them. And he's comparing it to winter where we got to sort of like forget what was going on in the world, stay inside, be warm, look at the snow. Let's look at how he's using enjambment to help send that message. Take a look at these first 3 lines. I want you to notice that these 3 lines are enjambed, since the sentence moves past the end of the line into the next one, carries on into the next line. Then we've got this line right here in the middle. It's got an end stop because it finishes with a period, right? That sentence ends. Notice that Eliot repeats this structure. He follows up his enjambed lines, an end stop, with more enjambed lines. Covering, feeding, carries on into the next one here. So the other pattern I want you to notice here is that each of these enjambed lines ends with a verb. So what he's doing is he's using enjambment to emphasize these verbs that he associates with each respective season. When he thinks of spring, when he thinks of April, right, he thinks of breeding, mixing, stirring, this sort of mixing together of life and death and mushiness and that sort of grayness that comes with April. In winter, he's thinking of covering, the way that snow blankets everything. He's thinking of feeding, the way we stay at home and eat, and just sort of forget about the outside world. And in the middle here, he's using this end stopped line to break it up perfectly evenly. So we've got 3 little lines here about spring, 3 little lines here about winter, and this perfect dividing line. So here he's using the end stop compared to the enjambment to give the poem structure. Okay, so our takeaway here, Eliot uses enjambment to show the split between seasons. April or spring have their own enjambed lines, followed by an end stop, and then winter has its own enjambed lines. By ending each line with a verb, it helps emphasize how each season functions, so those actions that he associates with each line. Cool. Let's look at a second way that poets use enjambment. Poets also use enjambment to create double meaning. This is my favorite use of enjambment. I think this one's really cool. So what I've done here is I've taken this first poem from the September Suite by Lucille Clifton. Okay, sorry about that. This is the first poem in that September Suite series by Lucille Clifton. It's called 9/11/01. And what I've done is I've taken parts of the poem where she uses enjambment and I've sort of blacked them out so that we can better focus on one meaning and then the second meaning. So let's look at this first stanza. Thunder and lightning and our world is another place. No day. Okay, so right away, right, she's telling us that 9/11 felt like this awful storm in the dark. There was thunder, there was lightning, there was no day, right? So that's the first way of reading this. But then the line continues. No day will ever be the same. No blood untouched. So now we're thinking about how 9/11 changed the country, right? No day will ever be the same. And since she doesn't put a period here, but she does put a line break, she opens it up to be interpreted in both ways. So this one sentence has two meanings. 9/11 was a terrible storm at night. There was so much despair and fear there was no day. And two, 9/11 changed the way we view national security and our vulnerabilities, and how the world sees us so much that no day was ever the same. Cool. So she does something like that again in the third stanza, but let's keep going. They know this storm in other wares, Israel, Ireland, Palestine, but God has blessed America. We sing, and God has blessed America. Okay, so here she's listing other parts of the world where, at the time of writing, there had recently been terrorist attacks and civil wars, and she's suggesting that other parts of the world are familiar with this kind of storm, but usually here in America, we're blessed. We're separate from that sort of thing. It doesn't really apply to us. Americans get to sing. But then the line keeps going. God has blessed America to learn that no one is exempt. The world is one. All fear is one. All life, all death, all one. So she's almost sort of sarcastically using this idea that America is more blessed than everybody else, and moving on to say, well, now we're blessed to learn that we're not exempt from fear and death and life. We're one with everybody else. So, one sentence again, two meanings. God has blessed America more than any other nations, a nationalistic idea that we might be sort of getting chastised for believing, and she goes on to say that 9/11 has taught Americans they are not immune to fear and hate. So a second way of using enjambment to create double meaning. And here I'm going to drop another big fancy lit term on you. There's a fancy way of saying creating double meaning, and it's double entendre. Double entendre just means a word or phrase meant to be open to two interpretations. So these are examples where Lucille Clifton is using enjambment to create double entendre. Okay, I've got one more example here, this one's short. The third way that poets use I'm sorry, I forgot about this. First, I took that Lucille Clifton poem and I wrote it out as regular sentences with natural line breaks and normal punctuation, so you can see how the enjambment actually works. When you take it away, it doesn't have that same meaning. So let's look really quickly here. Thunder and lightning in our world is another place. No day will ever be the same. No blood untouched. So without the line break here on no day, without that enjambment, it doesn't tell us that there's supposed to be a second meaning. It doesn't ask us to consider that pause. And it just reads like a sentence with only one interpretation. No double entendre. Okay, let's keep going. The third way that poets use enjambment is to create surprise and suspense. So this is a really famous poem by William Carlos Williams. It's called The Red Wheelbarrow. And the whole thing is just one sentence, but it uses enjambment to break it up into 8 lines. So let's read through it real quick here. So much depends upon the red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, beside the white chickens. Okay, don't worry too much about getting this poem. People go crazy about whether or not this poem means anything or makes sense. Part of the point here is to look at the enjambment itself, to look at the fun form. So by taking a single sentence and breaking it up over 8 lines, William Carlos Williams is making us do this. He's making us say, so much depends upon what? What does it all depend on, right? He's building some suspense. We want to know what he's talking about. And by making us work and read through the poem before we get to the good stuff, he's making that more intense. Then when we find out all he's talking about is a wheelbarrow, it makes us even a little bit more incredulous. We can't believe it. All of this for a wheelbarrow? Okay, so whether it's something really important or dramatic, or something sort of silly like this wheelbarrow, you can use enjambment to create suspense and surprise. Okay, so here's where we're going with all this. We're going to do a little mini Poetry National Disaster project. It's going to have 2 parts, and it's going to assess 2 standards. Here's the first part, and all of these directions, the timelines, the links, the due dates, all of it is on your assignment sheet in your daily agenda page. So make sure you're going and looking at those directions. You don't have to get it all from this lecture. It's posted there too. Okay, so part one assesses the structure standard. What I want you to do is read the rest of the September Suite poems. Remember, the good readers of poetry read poems more than once, they annotate, and they do research to look up references and words they don't understand. You should expect to have to do that with some of these September Suite poems. Then, once you've read them all, I want you to pick one, maybe two of them that you understand really well, and prepare to analyze how they use enjambment like I did in this lecture. You might want to revisit the slides in this video. You're going to want to be looking for how lines end, how they don't end, where sentences start, and how authors are creating surprise, suspense, double entendre, and structure. Then it says use this template. There will be a link to a template with an example on it in there. Use the template to write 2 to 3 paragraphs on how the poem uses enjambment, cite specific lines in the poem, and explain how Clifton uses enjambment to create these tools. Lastly, you'll submit your analysis to the UC assignment titled Enjambment Analysis. Part 2 is fun. I think this is where we get to get a little creative. I'm looking forward to reading what you write. The nation currently faces a different crisis than 9/11. We're dealing with the social isolation, the fear, the economic uncertainty, and the sickness of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. What I want you to do is write your own cycle of at least 3 8-line poems like Lucille Clifton's September Suite cycle. So just like Lucille Clifton wrote these 7 poems to try to capture the feelings right after 9/11, I want you to write 3 poems, at least 8 lines each, to capture the feelings, experiences, fears that you and your family are undergoing right now. Those poems will be used to reassess the writing standard reflection. We assess the reflection standard in our narrative unit. So again, I won't be grading you here based on whether or not you're writing groundbreaking poetry, but on whether or not you're attempting to capture those feelings and those experiences. That's that reflection standard. When you're done, you'll submit your poems on Unified Classroom in the assignment titled COVID-19 Poems. Here's a quick look at the 2 standards. The structure one is new, so make sure that you read it before you take a look and write your own responses. The reflection one should look familiar because we did it with our narrative unit, and this will work as a reassessment. All right, y'all, get writing.